programming, counseling, crisis services, advocacy, and educational opportunities. We have adult programming, which consists of serving individuals 25 and older. We offer counseling, which is crisis counseling, individual counseling, family counseling, and couples counseling. We also have several support groups which we offer, which is men's and women's coming out groups, and then our TGNC support group. Can anyone guess what that stands for? It's a hard one, so any thoughts? There's going to be a lot of letters today. That's okay.
Is it transgender?
That's the first one, yep.
I'll get you rolling.
Transgender, gender nonconforming support group. Yeah, so
Okay.
that is, that's a new support group that we have. Transgender, greater, no.
Right.
So yeah, so no, that is a new support group that we started, led by our transgender resource coordinator. And then we have our anti-violence programming, and through that we offer several programs, healthy sexuality and healthy relationship workshops. We have a community resource guide with LGBTQ affirming resources, organizations, agencies. We have a victim compensation assistance program, so actually through that we're able to work with individuals that have been victims of a crime and help them get compensation through that, whether it's medical needs or lost wages from not being able to work, or mental health assistance. And then we also help with safety planning support, so working with individuals to identify safe people that they can connect to, places they can go that are LGBTQ affirming, and then also housing and shelter referrals. And oftentimes individuals in the anti-violence programming have been, are survivors of domestic violence. Housing and shelter is especially a challenge with the community that we're serving, particularly with transgender and gender nonconforming folks. Because a lot of the shelters are gendered, right? So it's a women's shelter or a men's shelter, and there's no real good fit where an individual who identifies as trans or as gender nonconforming to go. So one of the reasons, so we have a transgender resource coordinator. Can anyone tell me why it would be important to have someone specifically dedicated to transgender issues?
So they can better understand the community that they're working with.
Excellent. And what is kind of the major difference between LGBT and the transgender piece, you know?
I don't know, I don't know. I'm just gonna leave that, I don't know.
It's okay. We didn't go over it yet in the thing, but. So transgender refers to someone's gender identity. Lesbian, gay, bisexual refers to sexual identity. And there are often additional barriers to individuals that are transgender that don't necessarily exist for individuals that are LGBT. And so it's important to have that person in there that can work with transgender and gender nonconforming individuals to help them with resources and referrals, because services that might be appropriate for people that are lesbian, gay, bisexual might not be appropriate for individuals that are transgender. And we can see that especially when it comes to like housing, employment, different medical providers, because trans individuals don't have the same protections under the law currently that LGBT people do. So our transgender resource coordinator assists with that. Also, they can assist with like the name change process, which is quite a process. I didn't know that until I started working here. And can help with any advocacy that they need.
So, as Natalie was referring to, we have our beautiful before acronyms. So the difference between the first three is that there's sexual identity, so gay, lesbian, someone who experiences romantic, emotional, or sexual attraction to someone of the same gender as themselves. We click into the next one. I wish they all popped up at the same time, but they don't. I don't know why.
Oh, there we go.
You just be gentle with it. So bisexual. Who has heard a definition of bisexual, whether it's the one that you see up on the screen or whatever you have here? Yes, in the back of the sunglasses.
Yeah, definitely. I have a daughter who identifies as bisexual.
How does she explain that sexual identity?
She's used to date boys, and now she dates girls, and that's where she feels most comfortable because she's been with boys. She's labeled up that.
But anybody else? I saw a couple other hands, so in the back.
I would say, well, someone who likes boys and girls, like, they can go either way.
Yeah, so noticing the similarities of the way that y'all are choosing to describe it is specifically pointing at gender. So having girl, boy, two different genders. So while the word means bi, people are kind of reclaiming the way that this word describes sexuality to explain that they can be romantically or sexually attracted to people of any gender, even those people who don't conform with normative gender ideals or normative gender roles. So kind of being able to say, like, you don't have to necessarily be a man, you don't necessarily have to be a woman, you can be anything on the spectrum, and there can still be romantic or sexual attraction. There's another word that kind of battles this one for that new title, and we'll get to that a little bit later. You can change to the next one. So now going on to transgender, the one that is a gender identity in the acronym. So the way that this is explained is somebody who does not feel the sex that they were assigned at birth. So it's like, you know, you come out, a doctor says, based on whatever genitals you present with, like, this is your gender, and this is your sex. And then those things, either they match or they don't match. So if they match, that's cisgender. If they don't match, that's transgender. So it's kind of just like saying, like, I was told I have these parts, so I should be this way, and I feel differently. Can you go to the next one?
What was the other word? Cisgender?
Cisgender. It'll be on another slide. It'll be spelled out. So Q. So this has been, sometimes you'll see the acronym with two Qs. Both of them will fill in the place for queer or questioning. So for queer, the way that some people use this is either as an umbrella term to kind of say that I am somewhere on the spectrum and I feel a lot of ways about a lot of different folks. Some people take it to be more of like a personal, like, political identity, saying, like, this is something that informs the way that I live my life, like, I believe in these kind of values and things such as that. So there's a lot of conflict in the way that the community uses this word specifically, especially because back in the 60s or so, this word was really used more as a slur. It has since been reclaimed and is kind of in this process of being understood by the new population, the new generations, and how they want that word to work for them. So kind of finding this balance with the word queer is understanding that someone who might be of an older generation might still hold on to this being a deeply offensive term, while as somebody who is, you know, in the early 20s or even still a teenager could use this to mean something radically different. So always understanding that not only do these terms have different meanings to different folks, they can also span generations and have different meaning across that spectrum. As for questioning, this is just kind of saying, like, somebody who's in those developing stages of not kind of fully understanding their sexuality or their romantic attraction. So it's kind of like, I don't know how I feel. And that's where we fill in the blank for questioning. So these are some more terms. So someone that is an ally, which is someone who is outside of the community, who is doing outreach, like advocacy, and like dismantling these homophobic and transphobic things that we kind of see in our day-to-day lives. This word kind of gets tossed around a lot. It doesn't necessarily mean somebody who's just kind of like, I understand that you have these sexual feelings and I'm okay with it. It's kind of taking a step beyond that to say that, like, not only is it just like, okay, well, you can exist and I'm not just ignoring you, but you can exist and I want to help foster a world where everybody feels similarly. I don't just want to say okay and walk away from it. I want to say okay and join the fight hand in hand. So has anyone ever heard of these two terms, aromantic or asexual? So, asexual, what about aromantic? So these two things were always thought to go hand in hand, and they're actually very different. So aromantic has to do with the way that somebody feels romantic attraction, being different than sexual attraction, therefore differentiating the two terms. So these two things are also on a spectrum. Because somebody identifies as asexual or aromantic does not mean that they always feel that way. It just means on like a typical day-to-day basis, they feel less romantic attraction, less sexual attraction than somebody who would identify as kind of being in the middle of that spectrum. So it's not really thinking of it as having like two anchor points, like an end and beginning, but kind of saying that there's an anchor all the way at the end, and it's just kind of an arrow that goes on to whatever it happens to be that day.
So, a person that would be aromantic or asexual, like, is that way most of the time? Like, can they all of a sudden, like, a random day comes around and then they're not aromantic or asexual for like a day or two, and then they go back, or
So they'll identify the same way. So it's kind of just thinking like if you think about like the baseline of depression. So there are some days when you're at the baseline of depression where you feel kind of just like you're in the middle, you're kind of neutral. There are some days where you'll either default to being maybe a little bit happier or a little bit sadder. So it's kind of thinking of it as a curve like that. So somewhere you meet in the middle, somewhere you can be at the end, but it's just saying that you can still hold that identity and you kind of go through these waxes and wanes where you feel differently. So it's kind of like thinking of a bar sliding back and forth.
Okay, but like, so the majority of the time they're just...
Correct, they're kind of just right there at that baseline where they don't feel anything.
Okay.
So that would be like their default. So they like default to feeling very little to no romantic attraction or very little to no sexual attraction. And someone who identifies as one of these two terms might not necessarily be the other one. Because some people can feel very high sexual attraction but very low romantic attraction, and therefore not fitting into both categories. So they're thought of similarly, but they needed to be differentiated because romantic and sexual attraction are not the same thing. That making sense? Throw a lot at you. So coming down to pansexual, this is the word that I was talking about that kind of battles bisexual for who thinks which one is more correct. Really, it's a toss-up. It really depends on who you're talking to and the way that they identify their sexuality. Some people use this term to say that I don't believe in the gender binary or the gender spectrum, so I just believe that I have romantic or sexual attraction to people. Now, when you go back to bisexual and having that bi in it is really already buying into the idea that there's a gender binary. That was a lot of bis in the same sentence. So, people are kind of saying like these words can mean the same thing and they can be different. It just goes back to who is using that term and what it means to that person specifically, which I know can also be a little bit confusing. It's kind of just the idea that you don't want to stick labels onto folks, you want them to allow to fill in those boxes for themselves and then understand what that identity means to them. Next one. So, cis-sexism and cis-normativity. Before reading this definition, has anyone seen either one of these words? A few folks haven't. So, for those who have heard of it, could you give an example of something that would be cis-heteronormativity?
So like white males, is that like that type of group, is that what you mean? Like,
No, so that's since white is referring to a racial identity, so cis-normativity has to do with this idea of cisgender. So feeling the gender that you were born. You have these genitals, you feel this way, you are this kind of person. So it's this idea that all of the world works in that way. Every person is cisgender. So you were born a male, you are a male, you were born a female, you are a female. Yes?
So that's like the like if you're cis-normal or
Cisgender.
cisgender, you don't believe that there can be transgender?
Not necessarily. So it's not a belief. So cis-normativity would be like thinking about if you walk down the hall, I bet you there's a male's bathroom and a female's bathroom.
Yeah.
And then there's just like this is a bathroom. It has a toilet in it and a sink and a door. That's a bathroom. Where it's just kind of like you can use this bathroom. It doesn't matter what your gender is, who you identify as. The idea of having two separate bathrooms, that's cis-normativity. Because it's assuming that all people who exist in the world are this way. Now, it's not necessarily a belief system. It's not like you grow up and you're like, I'm a cisnormative human being and this informs my belief system. It's just kind of speaking to this systemic thing that's going on around us, that's kind of making it hard for people who identify as transgender to be able to live fulfilled in the world, because there are all these barriers that are completely out of their control. Is that kind of making sense? So this idea of like thinking about like schools, like very lower level schools, like preschools, like daycares, elementary schools, are very gendered. Like girls get like the pink supplies, the boys get the blue supplies. Like, you know, we line up by gender. We're taken to our separate bathrooms. Like, and then as you grow up, you have locker rooms that are gendered. And all of these things that are kind of sending these subliminal messages to people who don't identify this way, that this is strange, this is weird, and that's kind of starting to inform some of the ways that they begin to internalize their feelings later down the road.
So being cisgender doesn't mean that you will necessarily like engage in cis normativity. Just cisgender just means your sex assigned at birth matches your gender identity now.
Yeah.
And then we're talking more about like how cis normativity plays out in our society.
That was even really
Is that?
So it's kind of like, I identify as being cisgender. I was born a woman. I identify as being a woman. Like, I'm just cisgender, and like, that's fine. A lot of people are, but it's kind of just showing that some people are and some people aren't. It's not necessarily saying that like, if you are one thing, you automatically can't believe in or can't identify with or can't understand the other. It's just kind of like saying we're drawing a distinction between people who are transgender and people who are cisgender, just to show that it's okay to be either way, and we're just giving those terms. It's all an idea of throwing labels on everything, but it's just kind of the way that we understand. So somebody can say like, I identify as being cisgender, and we understand what that means, and then someone says, I identify as transgender, and we're able to understand what that means. They're not necessarily like slurs or bad things.
Okay, because like I thought it was almost a bad thing. Like,
No, it's not like saying like,
okay,
if
I
you are
thought it
this,
was-
you're like, you know,
You're
it's not like
either an
comparing it to
ally
a
or
racist.
cisgender. No.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, this isn't a bad thing. It's just a big
racist.
systemic
I was
thing.
like, I thought it was kind of like the equivalent of racist.
No.
Okay.
It's just showing that like we have these barriers in our society that exist, and like people who identify as cisgender just might not notice them the same way. Cause it's kind of just like, I am male, I am a boy, good to go. Like, there's the men's room, like here's the male's locker room, like here's all of my things, and that's just like,
There's always a box for me to check
Yeah.
off. There's always a mail box, right?
and like I like can just like navigate society normally, and then when you kind of take a step back and realize how those processes work from the shoes of somebody who doesn't identify that way, it just points out these roadblocks that have been set up on our society that are actually outside of a lot of people's awareness. Because when we identify with the norm, we don't need to see what is abnormal about our spaces. We just kind of go about our business day to day. Is that making more sense? So this also bleeds in this idea of heteronormativity, which is just the assumption that everyone is heterosexual and navigates the world in that way.
Oh, can you say what you said again? When we identify as the norm, then
When you identify as the norm, you don't necessarily notice what's abnormal about your surroundings. So this bleeds into this idea of heteronormativity. So it's just this idea that like, you know, if you are male, then you want to marry females, and that's it. It kind of just stops there. So a good example of this would be like if you are filling out tax forms, or you're filling out like insurance paperwork, and you have a partner or a civil union, like a domestic partnership, anything like that, but your options are only that you're married, you're single, you're divorced, you're widowed, you're separated, and those are your only choices. So it's like assuming that people have to fit into those separate boxes, and not necessarily understanding that there's different ways that people can relate to each other throughout the world. So it's also like assuming, you know, if you see someone who is very feminine presenting, you know, thinking about Thanksgiving coming up, kind of like grandma asking you like, oh, you're very female presenting, like, do you have a boyfriend, like, are you engaged yet? He's like, oh, grandma, I'm a lesbian, we talk about this all the time, but you know, it's just like that idea.
Can anyone think of any other like examples?
Well, I made that mistake with my niece, cause she was married, and,
when I saw her at my mom's funeral, when she was divorced at the time, and she said she was in a relationship, I'm like, oh, who is he? And she goes, oh, her name is, and then mentioned it. So I didn't, I just basically assumed, I had no idea that she was, bisexual, and, cause that's what she identifies herself as.
Yeah.
So I didn't think of anything of it. I mean, I guess I kind of should have known because her ex-husband now is transgender, so I mean, they were kind of in that relationship, so. But I didn't, I just went to, right away to heterosexual part.
So, yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Kinda just on what she said, how do you approach that situation? Like, would some people see you as an ass for saying something like that, or like when you just genuinely not know?
Well, I
Like,
think, yeah.
Is there any proper way? Like, are you with somebody? Is that the proper way to say it, or like?
Wait, are you in a relationship?
Okay, so like.
Yeah, but I also wouldn't get bogged down by saying what is and isn't proper, because I understand in this society that we live in, and this idea of political correctness and everybody wanting to jump down each other's throats. Right, that stereotype exists, and a big part of how all of that narrative is explained is that people will just get naturally defensive. When we don't know something, we don't necessarily want to explain. We don't necessarily want to show that we don't know or understand something. So our first idea is to be defensive about it. But sometimes, just as easy as saying, you asked, what his name was in the new relationship, and it's oh, her name. It's so people aren't necessarily going to jump down your throat either. So it's okay, I made a mistake, and that's okay. It's if you meet somebody who is transgender and you mispronoun them or you misname them, just saying, I'm sorry, say the new name, and just kind of keep rolling. Because the longer you harp on a situation, it's kind of you start digging your hole a little deeper, and we're not even meaning to do it. We're trying to understand, but we're also feeling that defensiveness, crap, now I feel backed into a corner because I didn't know something going into this conversation. And that's a scary way to feel, no matter what it is that we're talking about. That's a weird, crappy way to feel, backed into a corner. So it's just kind of being able to be brave enough to say, you're right, I didn't know that. That's okay. I'm gonna do better in the future. You don't necessarily have to stop and be I respect you, I made a mistake, and plead, but it's kind of just being able to say something towards it and then just kind of move on. Because the longer you talk about it, the weirder it's gonna get. And that can be true with just about anything. From a gender identity, sexual identity, to just talking about weird, uncomfortable things. Again, Thanksgiving is coming up. Kind of those conversations, what's your 5-year plan? I don't want to answer that either, Grandma. So it's these ideas, just kind of touch on it, and you can walk back away from it without feeling you need to go jump under a table.
Yeah, and I think, one thing that you can start to do is try to be more inclusive with your language, which is difficult because we haven't been taught to do that in the society. And so, a good example at my old job, I was trying to, my insurance was changing because I got married, and the HR person said, well, try to get on your husband's insurance. So they would just know well, does your spouse have insurance? Just little tweaks like that, because then it's I feel weird too, because I'm oh, do I tell her that it's a woman? It just gets super awkward, kind of for me too. Even with getting, we just bought a Sleep Number bed, and they kept asking what's your husband's setting? I'm I don't know what to say. So even that we're married, that's kind of a weird assumption to make with, it is an investment, but, so just be more inclusive with your language is a good step, but that's also difficult, and it's difficult for me too to do. I've made mistakes for sure, speaking with some of our youth, and misgendering and saying the wrong thing. So it's gonna happen.
More terms. So, a gender identity. So this is just kind of going back to that umbrella term. A gender identity is just an internal sense of what you feel that you are. So it's kind of not saying that it's not going back to these sexuality terms. It's just I feel this way, I am this way, this is how I identify it. It's just saying that you can have a gender identity and a sexual identity, and they are not the same thing. It's just stating that like this is an identity that you can hold, and this is the way that you express it. It's the way that you feel on the inside about yourself. So it has nothing to do with what's going on with your body. It's just mind and soul, essentially. So kind of the opposite of what we've been talking about is this idea of intersex. Has anyone ever heard the word intersex before? Okay, so intersex is
a hermaphrodite situation or different?
kind of, it's like in that family, like heading in that direction. So intersex means that someone is born with ambiguous genitalia. So it's kind of like I said, like, you know, usually you come out and the doctor's like, boy, girl, and you come out and you're just kind of like, I'm not sure. And a lot of times doctors or parents will have to make this decision as to what gender they're going to raise their child because they genuinely don't know. So it's essentially someone who's born with kind of a mixture of genitalia or ambiguous genitalia that doesn't really inform like what the sex is. So this isn't a gender identity. It means that when you are born, you are not male and you are not female. You are intersex. So there actually is a third sexual identity that people don't talk about very often because we have this tendency, like I said, that when these children are born, we just decide like, okay, like you're male or you're female, and we just pick one and we run with it. And then sometimes later in life, these people will grow up and be like, whoa, that's not how I identify at all. So it actually is a third sexual identity as in addition to male, female. So people who are non-binary and genderqueer is somebody whose gender identity just falls outside of the binary. So they don't identify with being female, they don't identify with being male, they just kind of identify as existing. And this, again, kind of exists on a spectrum that kind of just continues into infinity because there's not necessarily any real anchor point. It's just kind of saying, like, today I feel this way, tomorrow I'll feel this way. It's just kind of showing that there's a flexibility between the way that you identify your gender. So going back to what your gender identity is, where that's like an inside, like mind, body, or mind, soul, this is body. So this is the external way that you express your gender to the people that are around you. So it's kind of like your external presentation, like makeup, hair, clothing, those sorts of things. You can go. I know, the gender unicorn. This is one of my favorite diagrams. This is on the internet too, it's free, it's awesome. So kind of like what I was saying is the way that these don't have like real anchor points, they're just lines that continue into infinity. So what this is denoting is that on any one of these identities, you can be on any point at any time. So you can feel like more female, more male, more in the neutral. You can feel more feminine, you can feel more masculine, you can feel somewhere in between being androgynous or just being kind of non-conforming. And then it's showing like what I was talking about with aromantic and asexual, that these things are spectrums that just kind of continue into infinity. They're not necessarily always towards the end, they're not always towards, you know, other side, they're not always in the middle. They can fluctuate on a continuum. So it's just showing that there's not a real anchor point. And what this diagram, as adorable as it is, does a good job at showing is that all three of these things are separate. So your gender identity, your gender expression, and your sex assigned at birth, and then sexual attraction, romantic attraction, all of these things are different. And it's showing that they can be at any point on any of these spectrums at any given time. So it's saying that like, just if you identify a certain way, it's not like you have like put a push pin in that and like that's what you are forever. It's just saying that there's flexibility, there's variability, and there's a way that you can move across and back on those lines kind of forevermore. Said the raven. So before we play this charming little video clip, has anyone who is familiar with the importance of pronouns? A couple of folks. So we're gonna play this little video. That's real cute. And it does a better job at, well, they're just cuter at explaining it than I do.
Wow.
Oh my god, okay.
Can you all hear?
There's volume control on that box.
Okay, thank you.
Pronouns are basically words used to refer to a person rather than their name.
They, she, and he are all examples of common pronouns. He and she are gendered pronouns.
She's typically used by people who identify as female, and he's typically used by people who identify as male.
However, he or she pronouns are
Okay, sorry, hold on.
And if you can't make it any louder, I think we can hear it, can't we? Yeah.
So tiny. Do I have to do it without?
What a prank.
I don't even.
Pronouns are basically words used to refer to a person rather than their name.
They, she, and he are all examples of common pronouns. He and she are gendered pronouns.
She's typically used by people who identify as female, and he's typically used by people who identify as male.
However, he or she pronouns are sometimes used by people who don't identify as strictly male or female.
Some people prefer gender-neutral pronouns. Gender-neutral pronouns are generally used by people who identify as genderqueer or non-binary.
A few common gender-neutral pronouns are they, ze, and a, but there are a whole array of gender-neutral pronouns.
People think long and hard about the pronouns they'd like to use and why.
If you use the wrong pronoun for someone, that's what's called misgendering.
When a person has new pronouns, it can take a bit of getting used to, but it's really important to use the right ones.
A person's identity is very important, and it's super important to respect that.
So when people use the wrong pronoun to me, I find that I've gone through all this effort to kind of come out and be myself, and it's kind of just thrown back in my face. Coming out for me was mainly awkward, with a lot of people that used to know me, people didn't understand. I think there is a lot of misunderstanding. When people get my pronouns right, it makes me feel like I'm, like being myself, and people are responding to that and are just like respecting me as a person.
When people get my pronouns right, I feel respected by them, and I end up feeling a lot more comfortable around them. Sometimes if you identify someone with a different pronoun that they don't identify as, you can potentially actually upset them, and I don't think you should be upsetting someone in this process, and that's why I think it's very important to know what someone identifies themselves as and respect it.
It's not about like you're a terrible person if you mess up, or you're a terrible person if you take time to adjust. You're totally not. But it's more about making that extra effort for someone that you do care about, or just kind of being a bit considerate that everyone has different needs, and it's just a really cool thing to do for a person. And I think it's easy to not quite get that, or just see it as, there's a person who's mad at you, and outwardly they might be a little bit upset, but inwardly what they're feeling that's motivating that reaction is so much more an understanding that they're not hating on you, it's just that they really are probably a bit fed up and a bit hurt.
It's not always easy to come out and tell people that you're trans. Never assume someone's pronouns, just ask if you're not sure. Using the correct pronouns is a pretty big deal, and it's a really awesome thing to do.
Genitals don't equal gender.
This is probably the biggest mistake people make. It's a pretty easy assumption to make, but genitals and body don't actually reflect anything about a person's gender at all.
Above all else, don't try and argue with this person, whether you personally agree or not. A person who's asking you to use those pronouns likely has put a lot of thought into it and trusts you. Basically, what's more important? Someone's anatomy or who they really are and their happiness?
Sometimes, however, you will slip up and use the wrong pronouns. It's not good, but it does happen.
Getting used to someone's new pronoun can take time.
And you may feel pretty awkward or even guilty when you make a mistake.
Some may sound pretty strange at first, and changing the words you use in general can be harder than expected.
If you do slip up accidentally, it's important to not lash out at the person or blame them. You might not pick it up instantly, and it's important to try hard on this. But if you do slip up, don't snap on it.
Just keep trying your best and you'll get the hang of it with time.
Don't freak out, just make a quick apology, correct yourself, and keep going with the conversation.
Making a big deal out of it is probably going to make them feel bad and make the situation very uncomfortable for both of you.
If you hear someone deliberately or even accidentally using the wrong pronouns for a person, don't hesitate to pull them up on it and politely correct them.
Hopefully that helps to explain pronouns a little bit better and lets you know how much it can mean to a person. And it's super important to get them right as much as possible.
Something as small as a tiny word like that could have a huge impact on a gender diverse person. Both how they feel at the moment and how they feel in the long term.
Having good, accepting, awesome, and loving people around you can really be life-changing.
Thank you so much for watching our video. This video was completely written, filmed, and edited by us. The gender...
Oh, nope.
recommend asking someone if they're a boy or a girl, because
Right.
I've been punched in the face for that before.
Right, it says you should ask them what they wanna identify as, but you're gonna walk up to somebody and say, oh, are you a girl or a boy?
Well, it's asking someone to identify what their pronouns are by asking what they are, instead of making the assumption, because you're assuming that by saying, are you a girl or a boy, that they have to be either.
See, to me, that'd be uncomfortable even asking what their pronoun is, like, I'd be more uncomfortable asking something like that than mistakenly saying, you know, female or male. I mean, I can correct that. If you correct me, I can correct that, and then next time I see you, I understand, versus coming up and saying, so. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, so at the center, we've kind of just incorporated it into a lot of things that we do. So like even on our email signature, or on our business cards, we'll have our pronouns in there. We also incorporate that into our intakes, and so it just becomes part of the conversation. You know, what are your gender pronouns? And also with introducing people, like a new person comes into the drop-in, we also do pronouns as well. And that's a lot of information to take in, because I can hardly remember names. And so just asking, I think can show like a lot of, it will show someone that, you know, you respect them enough to want to call them by their preferred pronouns. And so I think a lot of people, when they're asked that, won't see it as offensive. That you're actually going out of your way to make sure that they're comfortable and you're asking them what they would like to be referred to as.
And it's,
See, I
and
guess,
it's not
like-
just male or female.
Right.
I guess like in your community, when you're in the LGBT, you know, in your building, stuff like that. Like if I were walking down the street and I see Joe, I'm not gonna walk up to Joe and be like, oh, what kind of pronoun should I call you? Cause that, to me, I'd feel uncomfortable, cause like looking at him, now I don't know what Joe is, we're not that close. But looking at him, I would think Joe was a guy, so I just said, hey, he's really cool. I like hanging out with him. So I guess, I don't know, I don't know.
It's almost like it's your natural, throughout your entire life. It's just what you've been used to.
Right.
Growing up, I'll admit, I guess I'm ignorant towards this to an extent, because like I've only really noticed all of this in like the last, I feel like only 3, maybe 4 years. I mean, back in high school, everybody in my high school kind of made fun of the LGBTA, because it was like, they don't know what they're doing. And it was just kind of normal, I guess. And like, I don't mean to upset somebody, but like, I guess if you're happy, I'm good with that. Like, I guess I don't care what you identify as, or what, as long as you're happy, I'm good.
Right, it's not that I don't care.
I don't wanna upset somebody, but I just, like, I don't know how to.
Right, for me, when I was being brought up, there was male and female, that's it. I had a cousin who was gay, and first time we met him, my dad's like, well, he's really happy, and he's a little different, but he's happy. And, I mean, we saw him, and we kinda knew, being in school, you kinda learned the unreal version of what gay is. So, I mean, as soon as he got in the car, he had on a picture, so we knew he wasn't, you know what I'm saying? So for me, it's really hard, because this is very, very new to me.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I was talking to my cousin at school one day, and she's like, oh yeah, you know, half of our cousins are bi, and half of our cousins are trans, and half of them are doing this, and half of them are changing that, and I'm like, whoa, like, where did all of this, like, come from? Like, to me, it's like a whole new planet or something. And I mean, I'm not trying to be offensive or mean in any way, it's just, that's the way I was raised. You were just who you were, and that was it.
Well, we even have some of that, like, I'll sit in on our older adults group sometimes, and the gender stuff is difficult for them. Like, I'll introduce, like, let's go around, say our names and our preferred gender pronouns, and that can be even difficult for them to do, because the way they were raised is very much it's male or female, right? And so, yeah, I think.
I promise I see you if your arm's tired. I promise I'm getting there.
So yeah, it can definitely be different, and difficult too, because this is how it's always been, right? And so
Right.
it's
Well, I
a lot
mean,
of
like-
new.
Like she's saying, what did you think Little Richard was, or, who's the other guy? Older singer.
What was his name? Liberace.
Yeah.
Like, those were people.
Like,
of
yeah,
their
you knew
time,
they
like-
were different, but you didn't really, I mean, you knew they were gay, or they were
Little
straight.
Richard was
There
not
wasn't
gay.
this bisexual and gender identity, and it was you were gay or you were straight, kind of, I guess, is the way I was
Little Richard
raised on
wasn't either.
Right. See, so this is all very confusing to me, I don't know.
That's okay.
You're being enlightened today.
Yes, very much so.
I went to a Catholic grade school, and I mean, if it came up in class, you were just told it was wrong.
Yeah,
They don't believe in God, so it's wrong, and that's kind of what I spent 12 years of my life hearing. And then even to high school, I went from a Catholic private grade school to a high school, and the majority of people just still said it was wrong. That's why I said like the last maybe 3 years since I've been out of high school, that's when it's come up. And like I guess I just don't exactly get it. Like I've never found I am a guy. I was born a guy. You know, I got all that stuff for being a guy. I've never not thought myself as a guy, so I just like don't get it, don't know how to approach it.
yeah,
But I don't hate somebody for it.
right.
I just,
I'm okay with whoever you
I mean,
are.
I've got people in my family that almost hate because I wouldn't say hate, they won't ever say anything, you know, out in public, but behind closed doors, it's wrong because, like, I disagree with them, but at the same time, they don't understand it, I also don't understand. Like, I have one aunt who's lesbian, everybody else in my family, and she only just came out like a couple of years ago. I've never had anybody in my family to like ask about it, to like get another opinion. All my opinions have been either guy or girl, if you're a guy, you
Well, it's
marry a
your job.
woman, you know, it's.
I feel bad, because I think you guys definitely have an uphill battle, especially with older people like me that just don't understand the whole concept of everything that's going on. And this has been very informative. I have learned a lot of, you know, maybe proper ways of
Yeah, I
trying
mean, it's
to.
just really giving like the tools, because with, you know, human service, you're gonna be dealing with people that aren't like you, right?
Right.
And so it's just giving you some tools and some insight of how to be more affirming and more safe when working with those individuals.
Ariel,
Had
did
your
you
arm
still
up,
have
yeah, so,
something?
I need to know you had to say that.
No, it's good.
No.
All of that
Well,
builds
I
up.
agree.
All that builds up.
No, but going back to you, I think.
You
with
can
the
call me out, it's
No,
okay.
I think with the society that we're in now, it's kind of, I feel like they
It's
would
more
be, they
normal
would
for
be
you.
more open to telling people their pronouns and being misgendered. Cause if I was misgendered, I would feel worse than having somebody coming up to me asking me what I would prefer more than them being like, oh, you look like a female, but technically
Right.
I identify as a male, and they'd be like, oh, you're a female? Okay, so hey, she. But I feel like it would be, in our generation nowadays,
Yeah,
it would be more of, hey, are you, which one do you prefer? Like, what do you want me to call you by? I just feel like nowadays that's more normal.
I would definitely say that, because to my kids, this is just normal. To me, this is, I don't wanna say abnormal, but to me, this isn't as normal as it is with them, because they've been brought up in it. And I don't hide things from my kids, I don't sugarcoat things with my kids. This is the real world, you gotta deal with it. You know, and I'm learning to do the same things. But like I said, it's just different because I just don't understand.
There's also a lot to be said to having a willingness to try and to understand.
Right.
So it's not like saying like, to go all the way back to where we're started, like if you go up to any stranger and the first interaction you have with them when you have no reason to be talking to them is to ask for their gender, that's just weird. It's like even if you go up to them and be like, what's your name? That'd be weird too. Like that's just a weird interaction. it's kind of going into like thinking about those more like delicate spaces, like working in human services, like going and talking to
Right.
clients, like.
That's completely, I mean.
Right, yeah, so there is a
more
big
open to-
differentiation. Like,
Yeah.
don't go into a bar and be like, person, who is you?
Right.
What is you? Because you're right, you're probably getting punched in the face. Like,
Right, that's why I said,
yeah, that's.
if we were just walking down the road, I'd be really comfortable with that. I think if I were in human services, I actually just got a job at Lamb Lake. I'm sure this is going to come into my world really quickly. And I understand that now, like, when I start next week, I may not necessarily come up and say, what is your pronoun? I think I would more listen to how they identify with each other and then ease my way into, okay, how would you like me to identify?
Which unit are you working I just want.
I'm working with the girls that have been trafficked.
Oh, Eastwood?
Yes.
Cool.
Natalie worked there, and there's like.
Okay.
Worked there for 6 years, yeah.
So I do appreciate that this came around now because I think it'll definitely help me. Open my eyes more.
Problem with gender identification in that field, that part, if you're working with girls, that's when traffic.
I don't know.
Never
I don't
know.
know what I'm getting into.
One thing too, something important
Kind of
with that is just like,
self-explanatory.
someone could be engaging or coerced into sexual activity, but that doesn't, like, with a man, but they could identify as
Right.
not being heterosexual too. So, could come into full layer there.
It's
Right.
definitely a little confusing.
Oh, okay. So this is just kind of talking about stats. So I work specifically with the youth program. So understanding that while we are in a generation that's becoming more open to these things, there are still people who grow up in different communities, in different times, in different places that aren't all reacting the same way. Like, it's kind of the idea if you go from like a major metropolitan area to a more rural community, you're gonna be brought up with these same values and ideas, and like you're going to have that instilled by your family that's coming from generations across. You're not necessarily like put in this space where like you're seeing all different kinds of people all the time. It's easier to kind of say like, this is my reality and I live within it. So when you have kids that come out as LGBTQ in these communities, you see that they have a higher likelihood of being verbally harassed, sexually harassed, physically harassed, especially LGBT youth of color, because there's still a lot of different factors that go on within the Black community that change their experience. So even understanding if you are a white LGBT kid or you are a Black LGBT kid, your experiences might not even be paralleled, because
Right.
you still kind of have interacting systems of oppression coming at people who have intersectional identities. So understanding that like a white gay male is going to have a completely different experience than a Black gay male within their own communities. And then even when they start to cross over, so understanding that like as these layers of oppression stack up on top of each other, that's going to even further increase some of these factors of oppression and the higher rates of risky behaviors, which is like drugs, alcohol, sexual interactions, like just kind of falling into like the wrong communities, like trying to find like a safe haven by kind of falling into some of these more dangerous behaviors, which is going to increase rates of suicide, or going to increase rates of depression, going to increase the rate at which these kids are accessing mental health services, and understanding that these citizens of homophobia, transphobia, like intersectional identities, systematic oppression is all working against this community. That's also going to diminish the experience of these youth, and they're living in that in their day-to-day lives. And so, I don't know if y'all are familiar with ecological models, but this is kind of just like a visual example of what I was saying. So as you start down like on the individual level and you start to stack these different layers of your community, and then both in the macro and micro systems, so going from community to public policy to like social norms, stigma, and understanding that these things change over time, which is like the squiggle in the end, how all of these things lay on top of each other and affect each other. So you can have different relationships within these spheres, but if you're seeing oppression across all of them, understanding how having all of these layers of oppression and how they change over time is also going to affect the way that you see the world. It's going to affect the way that you have your lived experience. So I hope that that makes sense. And then this is just the last side. This is just kind of saying the importance of health needs. So understanding that, again, going back to the sexual and gender identities, understanding that they're going to have different levels of systemic oppression, which is understanding that like race and gender falling into sexuality and understanding how those things mix. Understanding the mental health needs that are specific to this community because of the kind of experience that they have, and education around sexual health, because regardless if you had an abstinence-only education or a full-fledged sexual education, there's probably very little stock that's being put into LGBT sexual health. It's not very specifically focused. So then also understanding that transgender folks are going to need the same kinds of services, and also understanding that some of them might go for hormone therapy or medical transition. Not all trans people choose to do both or either of these things. You can still identify as trans and not even see those things on the horizon. But understanding that for some people, this is the kind of things that they are trying to gain access to, and understanding that gaining access to those needs and the barriers that surround insurance, community, public policy, like financial, all of these things kind of mesh together to make accessing those types of services even harder for this community. That's the last one. Let's see right.
So, more of just like the human service aspect, so somewhat.
Yeah.
Oh, access to, barriers to accessing care. So people could be reluctant to disclose their sexual gender identity when seeing someone or accessing care. Due to stigma, discrimination, maybe a reaction. There's an insufficient number of competent providers. So going to someone that is going to even ask, are you sexually active, and then with whom, is actually quite rare. And so actually having a competent provider is a barrier. And then there's, additional structural barriers that impede access to care, such as insurance decision-making rights and visitation rights. And there's also a lack of culturally appropriate prevention services, and we can see that with the higher rates of mental health and physical health issues across the LGBT community. Okay, so some tips. Never assume anything. That would be the biggest takeaway you can have from this. Don't assume anything. Ask what name they would like to be referred to, because also that might not match up with their legal or given name. Ask pronouns that they would like to be referred to as well in the context of an intake. Be willing to advocate or foster acceptance and understanding with other people that you work with within your agency, with coworkers, with other staff. And then refrain from, again, making assumptions. We don't necessarily know. Someone could be presenting a way. A good example is with, again, the older adults group. They're very fun. I had this individual come for the group. This person was maybe in their 70s, looked very much like my grandfather, was wearing pants, like flannel shirt, suspenders, and said, "Hi, my name is Emily." I'm like, did not see that coming, right? So the gender expression wasn't necessarily reflecting their gender identity. So it's good not to make assumptions when working with anybody. And then creating a safe, inclusive space in the treatment setting. So do you have gender neutral bathrooms? Do you ask about, want an intake form, not just male or female? Do you have other options? And then are the clients seeing themselves reflected in the space? Do you have any literature about LGBTQ resources? Would be a good example. All right. Be humble and ready to fumble. So you're definitely gonna screw up, and that's okay. And knowing that and just working, if they can see that you're making an effort, I think that goes a long way. And so don't, become confrontational or argue with them. Just be like, yep, slipped up, sorry, let's move on. And then these terms, there's a lot of terms that were thrown at you today, and they will continue to change and grow. And so just keeping up to date on those terms can be helpful. Knowing the difference between gender and sex, and then gender identity and sexual orientation is a big one. and knowing that one doesn't always equal the other. So being male doesn't automatically mean you are attracted to women, right? And then be open, affirming, and keep informed. So keep up on news. What are some things that are affecting the LGBT community? What are some new terms that I need to update myself with, right? Again, recognize that gender identity and sexual identity and gender identity will continue to grow and evolve, right? So it used to just be gay and straight. Now we have realized that there's a lot of different terms people can use to identify themselves. Be willing to meet the client where they're at in their development. So you might be working with individuals that are questioning or are not sure or are going through a transition process. So be willing to meet them where they're at and understand that it is a process, right? And then with working with parents, the understanding that they're likely not going to be where their child is in the understanding or acceptance of their journey. When working with youth who have come out and their parents are struggling to adjust, I usually say to them, how long were you thinking about this and going through this over and over again in your mind before you actually told them? And they're like, oh, years, I've always known, or something like that. It's like, well, your parents found out yesterday, so let's give them a little time to adjust. And that can be difficult for parents too, because oftentimes they have a vision of what their child will grow up to be and the experiences that they'll have, and sometimes when they hear, oh, my child is gay or is transgender, it's more of a fear and an unknown of what will their life be like, what are some of the obstacles that they will encounter, and that's okay. That's okay to work with them through that.
I went to that slide. Did you already talk?
Oh, okay, thanks. And then encourage parents to educate themselves and look for other resources and people to work with and communicate with and find a common ground with. That's pretty much it. Okay. Questions?
I forgot to pass it.
Oh, that's okay.
Whoops.
We had a folder.
Yeah, I'm supposed to have a jar, but I forgot that too.
So is there any question? I mean, not just about, I guess, LGBTQ information, but just like working in the human service field, right?
Well, is there a lot of, I don't know how to say this, like, issues in the community, like how, like say if they're a lesbian, they don't understand how people can be like transgender, or is there a lot of issues with that, or do you think everyone's just open-minded?
I think there can be.
There can be, with like the older generations, you think?
Sure, the older generations, and I think too it's very different. There's a lot of different layers, and so I think it can be hard for someone to have a full understanding of someone else's experience. Even though I identify as a gay woman, I still have an extreme amount of privilege, and so I might not be able to understand a lot of where maybe like a trans woman of color is coming from, or the obstacles that they face, right? And so I think there is like a learning curve there, but that's something, at the center that we're definitely trying to do. And that piece is really important, so I think, that's why it's LGBT, and they're definitely under that umbrella.
I was just gonna ask, what's the hardest situation you two have either been in? Like, while working? Has there been a situation where...
Like working in general?
Yeah, like, what's the hardest thing about doing your job? Like
This
that?
presentation, no, I'm just kidding. I don't know.
Anything that stands out?
I guess so I used to work at Led Lake for many years as a therapist and then a clinical coordinator. I think the hardest thing was seeing a youth work so hard when their parent wasn't, and then that being a barrier for them to go home would be probably the hardest part of the work I've done.
I'd say mine is pretty similar, but it's kind of, I did a clinical internship in residential care before working at the center, and one of the hardest things that I would see is that a child, I worked in dual diagnosis, so having a mental health and a substance use disorder, and a child would work so hard to overcome all these own barriers, but they end up going back to a community that has no social supports, that has no community resources, might not even have transportation to resources, that might be completely in another county. If you think about, you go just a couple more miles north of here and you start to be in the sticks after a while. So there's not a lot of resources in these smaller, more rural communities. So you'd have these kids who made these huge gains that would all get lost because the environment that they were going back into gave them no supports for all of the work that they did on the front end. So it's like they were set up to fail in the end. And that's kind of just a hard thing to understand about the system in certain places, in certain types of work.
I was reading an article, I forgot where, I think it was on Facebook, you can't believe everything on Facebook. But it said that, I don't know if I'm saying this word correctly, pedosexuals wanted to be recognized as like part of the LGBT community. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think that they belong in the community, because I don't think it's a legitimate sexual orientation.
Is that somebody that's just, because another thing is, who are the people that are, like, we're trying to be more open as a society, and in our society there are shitty people. Who are the people that are trying to abuse it? Because I think the people that you just described, my personal beliefs, is they're abusing it. They're the ones that would, like, all the work everybody in the LGBTA community has done, those would be the ones that destroy it.
Yeah, I mean,
Because
the big difference
there
there
are
is,
ignorant people.
it's illegal, and they are engaging in someone who can't consent to sex, right? So,
I mean,
Yeah.
but it's also like understanding that if you establish or think yourself to be like a legitimate, you've decided this is a sexual orientation, and I'm sure you have some amount of followers, you identify that way, and trying to just like jump on a ship that you see is kind of starting to leave port. It's like, well, maybe if I can hook my, boat onto this while we're going out to sea, maybe I can just get pulled along while everybody's kind of freaking out about all these other things and not really seeing that we're kind of trying to like slide in there. But at the same time, like it's never going to be recognized as legal or legitimate. I mean, you can decide that you're going to slap an extra P on the acronym and throw it out somewhere, but the community is never going to say like, oh, okay, like this is something we're going to claim now because you feel like you have a marginalized identity. Like there are people that are going to like bastardize things that are going on in our society because they want their thing to be legitimized. And it's kind of understanding that like, yeah, just because you decide this is a sexual orientation doesn't mean that you get to just like jump on the ship, essentially.
It's just that kind of.
So I didn't hear what the term you said was.
I think I'm saying it correctly. It's called a pedosexual. It's like pedophiles want it to be recognized as a sexual orientation. They want it to be understood that.
Oh, we're all there now.
Is that kind of like the guy that, I think in the last, like, maybe 2 weeks, the guy that came out, he's like, I want to say he's like 63 years old, and he just said, well, I identify as a 45-year-old.
Yeah.
Is that's, okay.
I mean, I can identify as still being 18, but
That would be
I mean, maybe I feel that way,
If I
but
cut off my beard, I pass for 17 at most places, so I mean, does that make me 17?
Sure, why not?
yeah, that's kind of just weird. I mean, like if you wanna feel
Seems
like
somebody that's
like who doesn't want to be young again at 60? Like, I'm not in my 60s, but I imagine being 45 is like where you want to be. My mom's celebrating her like 17th, 45th birthday soon, so
It works.
I want to identify as 63.
Any other questions?
Downhill.
Any other questions you have? Molly?
The Milwaukee Pride Fest, I've heard there was like a lot of protesters.
Oh,
We had fun.
there's usually like one guy.
Yeah, like
with a big sign.
Yeah, there's one guy with a sign that's
And that car that drives around.
telling us to repent.
With the
one
loud
that's preaching
horns
the
on
Lord.
it.
Yeah, like I wonder how he goes under bridges because thing's too tall, but.
Not a ton. I've actually experienced more protesters at like City Hall when we're like ordinances are trying to pass. But
Just deal with it, or?
I mean, I kind of just see them as being kind of misinformed and ignorant, and more of just, I know what I'm doing is right, so. You know, they have every right to protest, but I'm not going to indulge them,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and then also some some queer people also are somewhat religious.
Mhm.
I'm Catholic.
Yeah.
But I don't believe that there is a God somewhere.
Yeah, I think it's a big misconception too. I mean, I was raised Catholic all the way through undergrad. I went to Catholic schools. I still engage to a certain degree. I'm the godmother for 4 children. I was just at a baptism. So, and I'm gay. I don't, you know, I've made peace with that. And
So, this might be a little touchy, are the churches more apt to accepting you now? Or do they
I
kind
don't
of?
really go
I think it depends on the church. There's a
I
church
think it
by
just
me
depends on the
that
church.
says they
It de-
accept everybody.
Yeah,
when
there's
they fly
definitely
the
different
rainbow
churches
colors.
that are more LGBT friendly.
That's cool.
Yeah, that is really good. Because I know a lot of, I mean, I don't know anything about Catholic Church personally, but from what I understand, if you don't conform to exactly what they want, they pretty much just, I don't wanna say disown you, but
Don't
move you
support
out.
It depends upon the church, really.
Yeah.
I mean,
Any other questions?